Okay. Welcome to Silent Book Club Author Chats. I am Guinevere Delamere, co-founder of Silent Book Club, and joining us tonight is Kara Lee Corthron, who's the author of Daughters of Jubilation. I do want to mention right up front, for those of you who are watching live or on the recording, this book does talk about some difficult subject matter. So if any of these topics such as rape or racism or violence are triggering for you, just please be mindful of that in advance. With all of those little bits out of the way, Kara, I want to thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. This is fun.
Kara is an author, a playwright, a TV writer. She is a woman of many talents, and so we are really excited to talk to you tonight. Now, since we are not a traditional book club, not everybody here has read Daughters of Jubilation. So I'd love to get started with having you give us a little introduction to the characters and the story.
Sure. So Daughters of Jubilation is about the latest in a long line of magical Black women, going back to the time of slavery and possibly beyond. So it focuses on this teenager, Evalene, as she's discovering that she has these powers. She's 16. And her mother kind of refused them. Her mother is very Christian and thinks of jubilation as kind of devilry. So she kind of repressed all of that inside of her. But the powers are coming on really strong for Evalene, and she needs some kind of help, some kind of mentorship. So she reaches out to her estranged grandmother, who kind of becomes her coach, her mentor, as she's learning how to control these powers so that they don't, hurt her or other people unintentionally. And at the same time, she is falling deeply in love with her crush, Clayton, who she's had a crush on since she was a kid, and he's finally sort of seeing the light, and he's falling for her as well. So there's kind of this kind of nice summer love story happening while her magical powers are burgeoning, and she doesn't really want him to know about it. She doesn't want to seem like a freak. Understandably, and on top of all of that, this is the South. It's 1962, and we're in they're Black. So we're living in the Jim Crow South. So things are not always easy. And there is a white tormentor out there who's a little bit obsessed with tormenting Evalene that she has to deal with. So ultimately, the magic, she finds that really the reason that this magic has been created is to protect these women against the evils of white supremacy.
I mean, I was reading this book, and so much of it is so relevant to the current moment that we're in. And, and I was just, I know that books take a long time to get sort of from the page to publication. And the fact that it's publishing now is really striking. I'm curious about what inspired you to write the book, and whether you were influenced by current events while you were thinking about it and writing it.
Yeah, sure. Well, the book came from several different places, but one of my favorite kind of stories that I will share, because I feel like this is sort of the pivotal thing, was this photograph that I saw several years ago. That it was a photo by Gordon Parks, who, if you don't know, is a very much revered African-American photographer. He's now passed, but he did this series in 1956 that was in Life magazine, and it was all about chronicling everyday life for just normal Black people during the Jim Crow South. He was in Mississippi and Alabama, I believe. And several years ago, they published these photos that didn't actually make the spread. They were kind of rejected, I think it's 16. And I was like, oh, what are those? So I went and I saw this exhibit, and this one photo really stood out in my mind. There's this little Black girl. She's maybe like 10 or something. She's in the foreground, and she has this kind of almost sly smile on her face. Behind her on the porch, there are two adults. You can barely see them on this like little house. And in the distance, there is this kind of weird disturbance. Is it a cloud of smoke or a twister? It's a storm coming. It's not quite clear what it is. But when you first look at the photo head on, it almost looks like it's coming from her head. And it stayed with me. And I was like, logically, I know that's not what's happening, but wouldn't it be amazing if it was? Like I just thought, what would it be like? What would this child's life be like if the power of a thought could wreak havoc in the world? And that was kind of the first real seed that I had for this book. It's funny though that you bring up current events, because the original draft, which I began in January of 2016, was very different from the one that's published. There were actually two protagonists. One was Evalene in 1962. The other was her granddaughter in the current day. So the book went back and forth between time periods, as her granddaughter is going through the same pain and difficulty that she is going through as a 16-year-old. So it definitely jumped around in time. It was kind of big, um, kind of epic. And what ended up happening, I'd worked on that particular version of the story for probably about a year. And my editor at the time, we had a tough conversation where she said, I think it's just Evalene's story. And I was like, secretly I did too, but I was resisting that because I was like, well, then I'm going to have to explain why I'm just writing this 1962 book. Everyone's going to want to know why. So I was like, no, we have to keep it in contemporary, right? And she was like, her voice just, it's so dominant and it sings. And I was like, yeah, I know. So that book went away in my files, that half a book, it's still there somewhere. And then I kind of started over and reimagined the book because, I suddenly had this very slim volume. And I was like, well, what else, what else can happen? How can I dig deeper? So it wasn't like a page one rewrite, but it was a pretty significant rewrite at that point. So it's taken quite a journey to get to this place.
Wow. I mean, that is a tough conversation when you have so much down on the page and then you have to, take away half of it.
Right.
I mean, that's taking Kill Your Darlings to like a whole other level.
Massacre your darlings.
Massacre your darlings. Absolutely. Man, but I mean, it's so true what you say about Evalene's voice. It's so clear and strong, and I mean, I think that I'm wondering if the dialogue and the strength of the dialogue in this book comes from the fact that you are a playwright as well, and maybe like, can you talk about your background a little bit and your sort of path to becoming a writer, and how that influences your work in this book?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I think being a playwright definitely influences how I use dialogue and even inner monologue in the book, because I definitely feel like Evvie, even though we're in her head, so much of it almost sounds like she could be talking to someone, as she's talking, to herself or whomever. But I kind of like that there's this active quality to it, that it could potentially be a conversation if we were to lift it off of the page in that way. And I think that definitely comes from playwriting because, excuse me, in writing plays, if I'm writing like a long bit of text, maybe say a character has like a page or more where they're just talking, I want to think about how to lift that, how to make it unique. How do you make that voice so interesting that the audience would like to sit there for 10 more minutes listening, as opposed to feeling like, when is this going to end? So I think that kind of thinking definitely influences how I write and how I hear language, because I definitely hear voices often before I even start writing, and they have particular rhythms that I want to respect. So I think that kind of thinking in that way of writing probably does stem from playwriting. And playwriting, how I came to that is funny as well. I was originally an actor. That's what my undergrad degree was in. I was a performer, and I moved to New York, and I did like the whole auditioning thing, and the getting up at 5 a.m. and getting online for the cattle calls, and it was terrible, and it's really terrible. And I booked a few things here and there, but they were few and far between. And also, it never felt like it was worth it. Like I felt like I would work so hard, and then I would get a show, and I had this feeling like, is this all there is? Which was not, not great. So with that and the lifestyle being difficult, but more importantly, because I was tired of reading bad material, is why I stepped back from acting. I would be called to these auditions both for film, like indie films, but also mostly plays because I was in New York. And I would just sit there and I'm thinking, I could do so much better than this. And in my head, that was like, what's wrong with you? I'm not a writer. Why can't I do better than this? This is not that good. Of course, I never said that. But so originally I was thinking, well, maybe I'm going to write for myself. And I would kind of write these monologue pieces. And I was like, maybe I'll be a solo performer. And then quickly I realized, oh no, that's way too vulnerable. If I'm going to write, somebody else has to go out front and speak them. And I guess that makes me a playwright. It was literally like that process was how I figured it out. Yeah.
That is fascinating. And you also now are a TV writer as well.
Yes, I am. I'll tell you, okay, sure, I'll talk a little about that. I know, I'm trying to think, how did that come about? TV writing, it's weird to say, but it actually is a lot more similar to playwriting than people often think. Which I think is why so many playwrights gravitate toward TV writing. Also, it's a good way to make a living in playwriting, isn't? Let's be honest, it's not going to be real. Yeah, right now I'm working on a show called Servant. It's an M. Night Shyamalan thriller, and it's on Apple TV Plus. You can see season 1 now if you want. It's interesting. It's a funny, it's kind of dead baby human. No, not quite dead baby, but well, it's yeah. You have to see it. It's pretty dark.
I don't know. It might be too spooky for me. I'm definitely kind of a wuss when it comes to thriller type.
Yeah, this is a little spooky. You might want to sit this one out. And I also write for the show You, which is on Netflix, which you probably can handle. It's not that scary. But yeah, so I kind of came to that because my playwriting agent, she moved to a bigger agency and brought me along several years back. And she just asked, she said, do you mind if I show some of your plays to some of the TV agents here? And I was like, sure, whatever. And also she said, would you be willing to move to LA? That was this big caveat. And I was like, yes, I guess so. I was really like hesitant about it, but I was also so tired of being poor. So I was like, yeah, sure. So
that is a good motivator.
It really, really is. It's a powerful motivator. But so one of those agents he's great, connected with my work, and we've been working together. And he has hustled for me, and I've gotten lots of work in the last couple of years. So yeah, and it's now I'm in LA, and I feel much better that I'm not scraping by to survive.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad that you have many different platforms to share your work, because I think your voice is really unique, and and I don't know if you are cornering the market on spooky and thrilling, but like, I mean, the sort of menacing character in Daughters of Jubilation is like legit terrifying. I mean, some of the descriptions of his eyes, and I mean, he definitely gave me the creeps. So
that's cool.
Somewhere along the line, you picked up a knack for this. You found your niche here.
Yeah, I definitely am kind of the horror girl going way back.
So I mean, speaking of characters, what kind of research do you do? I mean, for this book in particular, so it takes place in 1962. It's in the Jim Crow South. Like, did you, I know you talked about the photograph that was sort of the spark, but how did you capture the time and place and the sort of colloquialisms of the era?
Yeah, I did a lot less research than you might expect. I did some. I definitely did some. Strangely, a lot of my family actually comes from the South. So a lot of their language, I kind of was just sort of in my subconscious from growing up, like a lot. Because I was like, wow, this is really coming quickly. And I realized, oh, that's because you heard this when you were in utero. So that was helpful in that regard. I did some research just like learning about that particular year. And certain things that were going on in the time and in that locale in South Carolina. And most of the research I did actually was on different kinds of African folk magic, as I was trying to create what jubilation was. And I was kind of like, steal a spice here, steal something there. And that was actually really fun. It was just seeing like how how people view magic, and they have for like centuries. And I was trying to like, how can I make something that feels that old and ancient? So that was probably most of my research was gone toward that.
Yeah. So one of the questions from Anne, who's one of the listeners today, she was wondering, where did you grow up, and did any of your childhood experiences make an appearance in your novel?
Yeah, I love that question. I grew up in Cumberland, Maryland, which is a really small town. It's about a 5-minute walk to West Virginia. Like it's definitely sort of the, whether you like this word or not, redneck part of the state. Um, Economically depressed. It's definitely a town where people leave because there are no jobs. There's just no way to like earn a living and build a life there really. But that's where I grew up. It was, I think, 95% white when I grew up in it. So there were just a lot of things I didn't have access to because I I just didn't I couldn't see theater. I couldn't see diverse. I just, maybe I'd watch PBS, but there was like a lot I just didn't realize until much later. Um, but my family is from different parts of the South, so that was sort of why I think I was feeding those voices into these characters. It's funny you ask if any of them are based on any people. I don't typically do that. I feel like I take a little bit of this and that from a lot of people to make like amalgams, because I don't like being locked into like an idea of somebody. Like, oh, this is Margaret. It has like I just don't think in those terms. But something that I discovered way late, like after the book was out. I mean, not out yet, but after, when it was about to go to the printer. I mean, I was done my work. That kind of dawned on me was that I think part of the reason I was really connected to this time period was that this is like my mom's generation. Like my mom could have easily been one of Evvie's friends, and she's not here with us anymore, but she never really talked a lot about her past. And so I don't really know too much about what her young adult life was like. I know she was a basketball player and she was a cheerleader, and she married right out of high school and then divorced kind of quickly. Like, so I know, and that I was like well into my 20s before I knew that. She just wasn't really that forthcoming about, her life. So I think in some strange way, unconsciously, I was sort of imagining what maybe that life might have been like in some ways for my mom.
Wow. So the protagonist of the book, Evvie, is 16, and and this is a young adult novel. So what made you decide to write for a teenage audience? And writing for that audience, did it influence the kind of story you told?
Okay question. I really love writing for young adults because I think that they're just a really great audience. I mean, adults are great audiences too, not to say that they're not, but I think that it's still a time in our life when things matter more. The stakes of life feel much higher, even when they aren't necessarily so. I think it's this kind of uniquely tender part of our development. It's kind of the last time that we're going to do major development as far as like how we grow and mature. Like after that, things kind of level out until the end. So it feels like it's this kind of really important place. And I also sometimes think about the injustice of being a teenager in the sense that you're so close to being an adult, like you're really, really close. And you might be smarter than some of the adults in your life, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to have the power to say that or to make what you want to happen happen. No, you're still this person that until you're 18, nobody's necessarily going to listen to how you feel. At least that was some of my experience. So I think that that's something I really relate to, but also teenage protagonists just come to me very easily. I'm not exactly sure why. That might be a comment on my own maturity. I don't know, but yeah, I often when really strong voices start talking, usually they're somewhere in that age range. So I just been paying attention to that, and I also love the genre because I read a lot of YA as well. I think it's just come such a long way in like the last several decades. So yeah, I like being able to contribute to it, and eventually maybe I'll do an adult book at some point. But right now I'm pretty psyched to write for teens.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it was such a critical part of the story too, because so much of Evelene's control or lack of control or sort of coming into her powers are tied to these big emotions, and the sort of first love and puberty, and just that time of life that you mentioned, like just everything is like big feelings, and
Yeah.
um
Yeah, and it's like one wrong choice and could everything could be ruined. And I sort of remember that feeling a little bit. It's pretty intense.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just, kind of feeling like you have a lot more control over what is happening around you than you actually do. I think that
Mhm.
one of the things that getting older, like, gives you a little bit of perspective to kind of realize how very little you can control things. And I think that that's something that Evvie is still struggling with, is that
Totally.
she thinks that she can fix things that she
Yes.
can't.
Pardon me. But yeah, I do think that's something she struggles with, of like, well, if I have this gift, why can't I make everything just right and work perfectly? And that's something that definitely takes maturity to learn isn't going to be possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about like kind of the dark side of the book, and
Sure.
like this is a dark fantasy, and there is there's a lot of violence in the book, and it's and I'm curious about like how do you balance like getting a YA book published, like being able to like be like, okay, like school librarians are going to have to review this, and like and like were there sort of like concessions that you had to make to get it published? Like did you have to sort of like like adjust the levels of the sort of the subject matter? um
I think that's an interesting question. So going back to what I was saying before about how there's an original other book that was like very different from this version. Um, in that version, there's a climax that works very differently and is a little bit more graphic in certain ways. And my editor at that time, she was concerned. It wasn't like they were saying we're not going to publish it, but she was saying, I just have this fear that that's all reviewers are going to focus on, and I just don't want them to lose everything else. And I thought she was right at the time. I didn't tell her that, but I did agree. Ultimately, I agreed because I had reasons for why I put that particular violence in, but I was able to see that I could make the points without it being so graphic. So what you've actually read now is way toned down from what it once was, whatever that means. And yeah, so and that happened, and as I kind of alluded to, my editor left, and then I got two other editors that came on and worked with me kind of in the last stages of the book. And yeah, that actually never was really an issue. I think that they were like, okay, this works. So it kind of became a judgment call for me, like how much is enough? How much is enough? And is there a point of too much? So I kind of just had to use my own judgment, knowing that it had to be a bit dark because it is a dark story.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think it's all really appropriate. I mean, like there's nothing that feels like it was sort of gratuitously added. Like everything is contributing to moving the story forward, and feels very genuine. And it
That's
and it really does sort of transport you back to I mean, to that particular time and place, and just the terror that that like these Black children have when like they're in this world that is dangerous to them.
totally, totally. And it's something crazy about your home being dangerous. It's like it's their hometown.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and I think that like that is really resonating right now. I mean, your T-shirt, right? Like this is a woman who was killed in her own home. And like this is not historical fiction. Like we are living this right now. Uh,
No, I know. I know.
um,
And I think that that's something that I've thought about so much is And not just for Brianna, but for many of us. I wish you'd had Jubilation on your side because, man. So yeah, it's like if there's a way to create a world where we actually can have magic that'll protect us, I was happy to be able to do it.
Wow. Oh, that is intense and like so powerful, and so true. And I mean, it also is so frustrating that like there is still so far to go. You know, that you know we are now, you know, we're now 60 years past this time period, and still fighting. But this, you know, this is making me think, like, what is your, like, what do you hope readers take away from the book? Like, what would you like, the sort of lasting impression and message to kind of be, to inspire other people?
Mhm. I think my big thing is I would love it if people could leave this book feeling like we each have a kind of magic inside of us. It just depends on what we do with it when we find it. And we can really do so much. There's a point about midway through the book where this character, Miss Corinthia, who's turning 100, she's a great aunt of Clay's. She talks about people that have talent in art or people that have talent as healers. Like all of these things are kinds of magic. You know, ours is just a little bit more blatant. And I feel like we do all have some kind of magic that we can use for good.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly feel like, you know, I mean, just the fact that we are now like living through a pandemic and our world has shifted so much, and you know, a lot has changed over the past, what are we at, 9 months now?
Or in 10, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, of the, yeah. I have no idea.
I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's March 856 today,
Exactly.
either something like that. But you know, it does, you know, it has created a situation where I think people like have really been forced to stop and reevaluate the world around them. You know, I mean, we have pushed paused on going through life as, you know, as we knew it, as normal. And you know, and there is kind of, you know, that there is some magic in like you being able to really like, all right, like stop the world and take a step back
Yeah.
and look at it, and you know, disrupt everything. And you know, and I mean, I'm hopeful that lasting change does come out of this moment, because it has forced so many people to, you know, to really take a hard look at like before and after.
Yeah, and themselves. Like I think that a lot of people blinders and it's like, no, the mirror has been lowered. You know, you can't hide from it anymore. How? You can't go anywhere.
We're
There's
all
no
just looking at
hide
ourselves on Zoom all day long. I
all
mean,
the time. It was great.
oh my gosh. Okay, so speaking of the pandemic, how has this sort of, you know, this new world order affected your work? You know, as a writer, just your own creative pursuits. Has it had an impact on your writing?
What's interesting is I very fortunately, I was fortunate in that I was able to be employed this whole time. I was, excuse me, I was working on the show You, season 3, and we were in the room. And March, when we were all sent home, we'd been in the room for about a month. So we had a lot more to go. So we actually created a Zoom room and continued working and finished the season out. And then I had like a week and a half off. And then I was hired on this other show, Servant, that I was talking about. So I've kind of been working consistently through. Um, and I don't know if it's changed necessarily how I work, except it's made boundaries harder for me to draw. Like I used to much more clearly be able to say, okay, I'm going to, you know, if I'm doing the room, we end the room at 3, say, then I'll do my work from 3 until 6. I will stop. It'll be time for dinner, and then maybe I'll watch something on TV. Like I feel like I was just a little bit. It was a little easier for me before. Now because everything is here, like in my home, I I'm getting better about it. But for a long time, I felt like I was just always working, And so I was really tired because I was like, well, I guess I'll go to sleep, but I feel like and I wake up like I was just here. I'm just doing this all the time. So that's kind of been the weirdest thing for me. And it's made me realize how much I was dependent on like coffee shops and things because I like to actually get outside stimulus when I'm working on my own stuff. And it's like, oh, I'm just sitting here all the time. But I can't necessarily complain too much. Well, one, because I've been employed, but I've been able to work. Like I've kept doing it. I mean, the problem is maybe I've done too much of it because I've had trouble turning it off. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the biggest change that I've noticed. We'll see going forward. I feel like it's gotten a little bit better, but it's tricky.
Oh yeah, I hear you. I mean that the sort of like there's just all I think it's when your computer is your entire window to the outside world, and then all of that is sort of filtered through like this device that is used for work, then it's it's just sort of always there in the background. It's like you just click over the tab and there's like whatever you've
Always.
been working
And
on.
like, not to mention that it's really not great for our eyes or brains to be glued into this black screen all the time.
No.
Oh my goodness. But
All right, so
before
are you reading anything?
yes. What am I oh, okay. So right now I'm actually reading that book. Um I'm thinking of ending things. There's a Netflix
Oh,
movie that just
okay.
came out.
Uh-huh.
I happened to watch the movie. I didn't know about the book, which was this huge bestseller. I just didn't know about it. I watched the movie and I was like, I don't know what the fuck is happening. I'm like, what is this? So I got the book just because I was like, I want to know what I saw. I'm like, oh, it's nothing like the book. Okay. And the book, I don't quite know what's going on either, but it's kind of fun. um, and it's interesting you were talking about horror and such because there are a few moments that like scared me in the book and I can't even exactly tell you why. Like one in particular where I was just like like I gasped because it was almost like someone had hit me, like it freaked me out. But if I were to describe to you what it was, it's not like objectively that scary. It's just something about the way it happened that I was what? It's just a very strange book. So I'm enjoying it. I'm like, yes, I'm enjoying it. It's an interesting experience. Yeah, so we'll see. And but I just read this book a little while ago, which is this beautiful book, which I would love to recommend, called The Yellow House by Sarah Broom. I think it might have won the National Book Award for 2019, I think. But it's a memoir about this young woman who's from New Orleans, and she comes from this huge family. Like it's 12 in all, 12 kids in all, and she's like the very youngest. Like her oldest siblings are like parent age for her because it's just this huge line. And this house, this railroad style house that their mom bought at age 19 for like super cheap. And it's kind of this story of how she tried to hold on to it, even though it was like falling apart and dilapidating and like dangerous and kind of scary ways. But it's like, no, that's my house. And then how like nobody was allowed really in it except for families. It was almost like the house was a secret. It's really kind of interesting and how it's this character, and then Katrina happens and things really shift. But it was really quite well done and quite moving. So I recommend if people are into memoir.
Okay, I wrote it down in my
Excellent.
little notebook here because we are always looking for good recommendations.
Oh, good.
All right, so I have one last question. If anybody that is on the chat has a question for Kara, feel free to drop it in the chat, and let me just make sure that I can see it. Great. So, do you have any authors or books who that influenced you? Like, do you have any heroes?
Yeah. Probably, like I have a lot. So I'll just think of a couple that feel that are kind of fresh in my mind. I'm continually inspired by Shirley Jackson. It's one of my favorite writers. We Have Always Lived in Castles, one of my favorite all-time books. And I also love The Haunting of Hill House. I'm really a fan of even her humor because she also wrote these comedic pieces that were so funny. Such a fan of her and kind of how she tried to build her life, which sadly was cut short way too soon. But she's definitely a powerful influence over me. Toni Morrison has been an influence over me. The Bluest Eye was like, when I read that book, I think I was like 17 or 18, it sort of changed my intellectual DNA in a way of like understanding what you can do with a book. Like you can write about something very ugly and it can be beautiful and still cathartic. Like you're not just punishing someone with material that's really painful. So that kind of changed how I saw creation in a lot of ways. My gosh, I feel like there's so many. Now I'm like freezing. Octavia Butler, I love very, very much. Kindred is one of my all-time favorites. Yeah, I feel like I have these kind of secret mentors, I call them, or secret teachers that I've never met, but I try to learn as much as I can from them. I still do. Like whenever I encounter someone new, a friend of mine wrote this book that I love called The Paper Wasp. Her name's Laura Nakamphora. So dark and messed up and crazy. And I was like, yes, I can learn from this. I can learn. Yeah, you're right. I gravitate to the darkness. I do.
Well, it's funny when you mentioned the yellow house, the first place that my mind went to was the yellow wallpaper, which is
Oh
that
God, yes.
short story. And like, oh my God, we read that in high school and I think I'm still traumatized. Like
That is a terrifying and upsetting story. Yeah, I think I was in high school too. And I was, what did you just give us?
Why are you telling us these? Totally.
I still remember that feeling. Oh my God. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, Kara, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but don't go anywhere. I got to make sure I can turn off the recording without ending the whole call.